More than 50 young people from Boston will take a stand for voting rights by going to Selma, Alabama. By heading off this Thursday, they'll celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act and the historic march led by the Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr. After the trip, their goal is to strengthen voting power in the city of Boston. To tell us about the campaign is a longtime voting rights activist, the co-project director for the Selma project, Reverend Ron Bell. Thank you very much for being with us, Ron.
Thank you for having me.
I think many of our viewers, if they haven't seen the movie, maybe they've seen Eyes on the Prize, footage from the march, but get to the heart of this. What difference did this march make? Well,
the difference is that 50 years ago, there were a number of people who marched with Dr. King over the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma to Montgomery. And basically, it led to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And because there were a lot of voter suppression and of course, inequality in voting as relates to people of color, and particularly black folks. And I think, we lose sight of what people went through. You hear folks normally say people died and fought for the right to vote. Yes, they did. But on that Sunday, it was very historic. The connection from Boston, we had a Unitarian Universal preacher by the name of James Reeb, who came from Boston when Dr. King called folks from across the country to come and march. He was there, and he was actually brutally beaten and killed during the march. And I think it's important, Chris, that, sometimes, a lot of the history is left out of schools. A lot of young people are not really paying attention. They know who Dr. King is. They get a day off, but they don't know all the other social justice activists and folks who are a part of the struggle and the challenges in our life. And they need to be recognized. And sometimes you have to relive history to get it across as opposed to read about it.
Well, certainly the curtailment of voting rights, the racial gap in voting rights was pretty severe in a lot of the South. But explain the context here, because there were sympathetic statements about voting rights from Kennedy and then Johnson, but this was going nowhere in Congress.
Right. And sometimes you have to have protests to get your point across. And Dr. King, was very much in conversation with Lyndon Johnson. And a lot of this stuff is displayed in the movie Selma in reference to what actually went on behind the scenes, the negotiating, the protests, the folks that were had their lives taken in reference to that. So I think that in this 50th anniversary, that a lot of information and the story can be told to our young people who don't have a clue what's going on in our history. And it's our fault as adults. A lot of adults don't tell the story or the correct story. And I think this is an opportunity to rededicate ourselves to the Voting Rights Act, as well as to get young people involved in civic engagement.
Well, certainly one thing that they'll encounter in the South is that 50 years later, we see a lot of pushback against voting rights. And, and a lot of this is in states with higher percentages of people of color, too.
Yeah, and particularly in communities of color, there are places that require licenses to prove that you're the individual going to vote. And I know there's a lot of things that are going on in our election departments as relates to keeping people from voting. And I think that this is an opportunity to get some of the things that are wrong, make them right.
What about what you want them to do coming back to Boston?
Well, I want them, one, to get the history. There's an old saying says, before you know where you're going, you have to know where you've been. And a lot of young people, as I mentioned, do not know their history. They don't know the history of the civil rights movement. They don't know there were a lot of folks involved, black, white, Latino, and everything in between, that were involved in this historic occasion of the Voting Rights Act and what took place. And what we want to do is, one, get them that information, and then let them come back and meet with their friends, their family, tell their story, their experience, so it can equate to getting young people engaged and getting high turnout numbers, but also holding our elected officials accountable. I think sometimes, there's a scripture that says you give honor when honor is due. We look up at our elected officials as if they're guards or what have you, but the truth of the matter, they are servants to us. And I think people sometimes get it backwards. And we need to make sure that our elected officials are held accountable to do what they said they were going to do when they were running for office, but also around public policy, around the Voting Rights Act, and to make sure that we don't run into some of the problems in Massachusetts that are happening in southern parts of the country.
I know things might be less extreme here, but there are these constant battles you have to have, redistricting or where people go and do their polling.
Yeah, gerrymandering. I mean, that's been a major problem. Even here in Massachusetts, where districts are divided up according to race or what have you, where it gives certain elected officials advantages. And I think that, although it's not been problematic here as it is in some of the southern states, but we've had a number of problems. I remember in the election of Governor Deval Patrick, 2006, we ran out of ballots. How do you run out of ballots? And there were a number of people who couldn't vote. Some of the voting machines that should be checked before, the actual election day are broken, and so folks are unable to vote, and it holds it up. And people get frustrated at times. I mean, it's really discriminatory anyway, because the time of elections. I mean, I know there's a new legislation that was filed and signed by Governor Patrick, where you can register to vote 15 days or vote 15 days up until the election day. And that's supposed to happen, and you can register actually online. So these are ways of making voting fun, making it easier and more accessible to our average, ordinary person.
Well, the story of the march in Selma is you had a relatively small number of people at the outset. It grows to 25,000. It's a broad number, not just a big number. What's the lesson from that? I think you tried to apply that when you started Dunk the Vote.
Yeah, with Dunk the Vote, but one of the major events that I helped organize, actually I was the lead organizer for, was the Retracing the Struggle. In 2005, October 30th, we had John Lewis come, and we actually did the march that took place in 1965 with Dr. Virgil Woods, who brought Martin Luther King, Dr. King, to Massachusetts. So we reenacted it, and we marched from the first church in Roxbury to the Boston Common. And it was one of the best times. I remember the day before, it snowed. John Lewis was speaking at Boston College, and a couple of people from Mass Humanities had said to me, well, I don't know if we're going to be able to get 5,000 people on October 30th, 2005. And I never forget this, Chris, is that, people from all walks of life, Black, Latino, young, old, community residents, community activists, clergy, came together in this great moment in Boston. 2005. 10 years later, we want to do the same. But to be a part of, crossing that bridge, Edmund Pettus Bridge, and to bring that energy from people from all over the world, to bring it back here and to really, spread the message, spread the word. Selma was a great movie. I got the opportunity to see it. I learned some things that I did not know, I wasn't aware of. But I think it's when people start to understand what went on, it's more than just telling people that, your people died and fought for the right to vote, but to have a young person, their peer, telling them, listen, I was a part of Selma, the reenactment on Edmund Pettus Bridge. I crossed over there and I was around activists that were there in 1965. I think that's a good story, and it motivates other people to get involved. When we had to 5,000 people, no one ever thought we would get 5,000 people of all walks of life, on a winter day, October 30th. I mean, it was cold the day before, 70 degrees the day we had the event. So the lesson is let's get people engaged, keep them motivated, keep them informed, and so we can get people out to vote.
I don't know if there's any room in the bus, but if people want more information about this, what should they do?
They should call 857-417-5058, or they can send an email actually to myself, ronbell400@gmail.com. And we have about 10 seats left. And we've been fortunate to get some funding from some of our local donors here to help secure the cost. The young people are going at no cost. We have scholarships for the young people. We have around about 30 young people on the bus. We have adults and activists and clergy. I'm excited about it.
All right, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
For the Selma Project, Ron Bell. We'll have more news in just a moment.